This is section 2, Slavery and Wealth. Our essential question is, what was the nature of slavery in South Carolina? So in this section, we're going to look at exactly how slavery worked specifically in South Carolina. In each colony, the system of slavery was different and varied in its forms. So we want to look and examine exactly how slavery worked in the colony of South Carolina. The terms that you need to know for Section 2 are Middle Passage, Chattel, Artisan, Gullah, Stono Rebellion, Manumission, and Driver. Slaves from Africa. Most slaves that came to South Carolina came from the west coast of Africa. Most of the time they were captured by other Africans from rival tribes, either as prisoners of war or conflict between tribes, or they would just be kidnapped outright by rival tribes, and then taken to the west coast and sold to slave traders in exchange for guns or other goods. The journey from the west coast of Africa to North America was known as the Middle Passage, and this journey was horrific. It was usually a 4 to 8 week trip, typically on a boat that was designed to hold 300 slaves. They would try to pack in as many as 500. They literally were crammed in as tightly as possible. The sanitary conditions on board were atrocious. They would have to use the bathroom in a bucket, and oftentimes those buckets would only be emptied out maybe once or twice a day. Children would sometimes fall into the buckets and drown. Obviously, being in such tight quarters, disease was easily transmitted from one slave to another, so the mortality rate was very high. When a slave died, they'd simply take him up on deck and throw him overboard. They were brought up on deck twice a day and forced to dance, not as recreation but as exercise, and then taken back below deck. Slaves oftentimes would attempt to jump overboard and commit suicide rather than going to the destination knowing what was ahead of them. If they couldn't jump overboard, a lot of times they would try to starve themselves, in which case the slave ship sailors would take a device and force their mouths open and shove a mixture of horse beans and rice down their throat and force feed them. Once they reached their destination in Sullivan's Island, they would be quarantined for a couple of weeks just to make sure they were free of disease, and then they would be cleaned up and sold at the slave auction. And at this point, they're put up on the auction block nearly naked, so that they can be examined by potential buyers. And obviously, the most fit looking of the males would have brought a higher price, same as the females as well. Some slaves would remain in Charlestown and would work as either artisans or household servants. They would be known as urban slaves, but most slaves would be taken to the rice plantations between Beaufort and Georgetown, which basically covered the entire South Carolina coastline. The nature of American slavery. Throughout human history, slavery has really varied. Most slaves were captured in wars and didn't remain slaves for the rest of their lives, and children were not automatically slaves. However, in American history, slavery was very different. Slaves were slaves for life and were considered chattel or property. They had no rights to travel, They could not legally marry. Uh, they were almost all were black people from Africa, and their children, when they were born, were automatically slaves and would remain slaves for life. At this point, early on in our history, slavery existed in all 13 colonies, and it actually started in the colony of Massachusetts, ironically. Slavery in South Carolina, urban slaves and plantation slaves. By the 1730s, we've talked about this in section 1, the black slaves outnumbered the whites 2 to 1 in the low country. So there are really two types of slaves. There's urban slaves and plantation slaves. Urban slaves were mainly artisans and household servants, and some of the ironwork that these black artisans created is just extraordinary and can still be seen on some of the older homes in downtown Charleston to this day, and they're quite valuable. As far as household servants, they would have obviously worked within the home, served as butlers and maids, um, and obviously would have had a much easier life than the plantation slaves. They would have dressed nicer, uh, probably had a much better diet, and lived in the servants' quarters behind the home. Plantation slaves were taken mainly to the rice plantations up and down the coast of South Carolina. They were housed in self-built cabins, which were clustered in small settlements, mostly that would have been along the drive leading up to the main house of the plantation. The master and mistress of the plantation would have wanted to show off to their guests exactly how many slaves they had. And we talked about in class that this was sort of like, flaunting your wealth. They tried to take charge of their personal lives as much as possible, including religion and ways of coping with the system of slavery. Slave communication and a mixing bowl of cultures. The Gullah language, or Sea Island Creole English and Geechee as it's also known, is a language spoken by the Gullah people, also called Geechees within the community. It's an African Americans living on the Sea Islands and in the coastal region of South Carolina and Georgia. These folks created new cultural patterns which were influenced by Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans, and contributed to a unique culture in South Carolina. One example are the Gullah that are in present day South Carolina. You'll find most of them, again, along the Sea Islands, but if you visit Charleston, some of the basket weavers that you see outside of the market down there, they're examples of modern day Gullah. Slave punishment and resistance. Punishment was usually in public and was supposed to be humiliating. It included whipping, confinement, branding, being sold away from your own family, and other methods. Some of the punishments usually were the result of running away. If you ran away from your plantation and were caught, the first time you would be whipped. If you ran away again, the second time you would be branded with an R on your cheek. Second time you would be branded again with an R on your other cheek, and also have your ear cut off. So the punishment increased in how bad it was the more times that you committed an offense. Ways in which slaves resisted their circumstances were very hardly noticeable gestures, just comments that they would make, working at a slower pace, sabotaging tools or equipment, burning a barn and during the harvest season, physical attacks on white persons, which if you did that, that usually would result in severe punishment, maybe even death, or running away. The Stono Rebellion and tougher slave laws. All right, okay. So as we discussed earlier, whites were terrified of a slave rebellion. That's why they were so anxious to get the Scots-Irish and Pennsylvania Dutch to move into the colony to try to even out the numbers. But their worst fears were realized on the 9th of September, 1739. That was a Sunday in which a group of slaves organized and led by uh, their leader Jemmy, Jemmy, broke into Hutchinson's store and killed Mr. Hutchinson, actually decapitated him, and stole weapons and ammunition from the store and began to make their way south down the Stono River in an effort to reach Spanish Florida and freedom. Along the way, they killed close to around 50 whites, and eventually they were captured by a posse, and all 44 of the blacks that were involved in the rebellion were put on trial and hung for their actions. But what it does cause is the Negro Act of 1740 to be passed. And basically what this does is that it passes new laws that enforce the system of slavery and makes it much more difficult for a organized revolt to take place. It would be illegal for slaves to be taught to read or write. They could not move around freely. If they went to town, they would have to have a permission note from their master. They wouldn't be allowed to gather in a group unless they were being observed by a white person. So it definitely made their lives much more difficult. The rice fields. Slave knowledge and labor made South Carolina prosperous. That's evident from what we've learned from our previous lessons. But labor on rice plantations was extremely difficult. It was back-breaking labor. But it would be divided into tasks, meaning that slaves of different ages would be assigned a daily workload. And if they completed that task or workload before the end of the day, they had free time to do basically whatever they wanted. So it was a way to encourage them to work hard so that they could have free time. These tasks would be assigned by white overseers or a black driver who would have been another slave that would have been put in charge of sort of managing the day-to-day tasks that were being performed. By 1740, obviously rice production boomed. We've talked about the thousands of barrels of rice that will be exported out of the colony of South Carolina by 1740, and has really helped South Carolina become one of the wealthiest colonies of the 13. Indigo. As we've studied, indigo was introduced into South Carolina by Eliza Lucas Pinckney. If you'll recall from your reading at the beginning of the chapter, she and her family moved to Carolina in 1738 and acquired 3 plantations. Her father, Colonel George Lucas, was a officer in the British Army and got recalled back to Antigua, and as a result he left his 16-year-old daughter Eliza in charge of the 3 plantations that they owned. Not only was she in charge of managing the plantations, but she had younger siblings, a sick mother, and she had to manage all the slaves as well. So I think that is pretty good testament to her maturity. Um, but regardless, her father sent her some seeds to experiment with, and she tried several different experiments with the indigo until she found uh, the right way to produce the blue dye that is derived from the indigo plant. And so once she did that in 1739, South Carolina finally had its second cash crop. The great thing about indigo is that unlike rice, it doesn't have to be uh, grown just in the coastal areas. It can be grown throughout the coastal plains as well. So this made for much more opportunity for people to move further inland, and as a result, it helps South Carolina's economy to boom that much more. Based off of the slave labor that South Carolina used largely, um, South Carolina becomes probably the crown jewel of the British colonies. In fact, 9 of the 10 wealthiest men in 13 colonies lived in South Carolina. Um, at this time, however, how you got your wealth didn't matter. Um, Henry Lawrence, who was a slave trader, was as respected as any rice planter in the colony. So, as long as you were wealthy, it didn't matter how you got your wealth.